coming. Thanks to PSC for organizing, and to the previous speakers for doing a great job of relieving me from having to talk about a bunch of things. Most things, yeah. So now I can just kind of freestyle on something else. So first of all, I want to comment on something that Professor Tilley said this morning, which was she brought the examples of advanced settler colonialism, using the examples of the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to show that the way you end settler colonialism and this kind of apartheid is through politics of inclusion. I want to just really highlight that apartheid is very real in these states of advanced settler colonialism, and it's not over, right? The United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, you wouldn't be stretching it too far to talk about them as states that are committing the crime of apartheid against their indigenous populations, as well as other populations, particularly African American, Afro-North American populations as well. Also, Gulf states, if we look at their laws, you don't even have to delve too deep to see that there's a legislation of difference that's set up to establish and maintain a regime of racial domination by one group, in this case the citizens, of all other groups, which are the non-citizens. And then there's this kind of super racialized hierarchy within the non-citizen group in those states. So again, apartheid is not just an Israel story, it's not just a Palestine story. On the flip side, or kind of mutatis mutandis, apartheid is not the only way to understand what's happening in Palestine. In fact, as we just saw, when Palestinians come to speak about their grievances, they actually don't bring up issues that are directly pertinent to the crime of apartheid as it's defined under international law, right? So for us, the way we experience Israel, in addition to many things that have to do with apartheid and would be kind of slam dunk cases as human rights violations committed in the context of establishing a regime of racial domination by one group over other groups. For us, we experience it as erasure. Right? We experience it as an erasure of our history, an erasure of our identity, an erasure of our feeling that we've been wronged and we need to speak up and do something about it. And so we experience it as, we experience even the repression of this kind of activism as part of a broader process of erasure. There's no crime called erasure, right? We can't point to something and be like, let's sue Israel for erasure. There's different aspects of that erasure that do fall under legal categories, right? And so things like apartheid, the different human rights violations, the different crimes against humanity that Israel commits, has committed, continues to commit, are things that we feel the need to speak to the world about, raise as an issue, and to do this, we use international law as a means of communicating. In the past 15 to 20 years, we've seen a kind of reversal of this process, where because we've become so externally focused, we actually start to think in international law. We stop thinking in terms of politics, and we start to treat international law as the ceiling and the only way to convey an idea. I don't know if I've conveyed this idea clearly to you. I don't want to spend the whole talk on it, but I'm happy to come back to it in the discussion. The reason I bring it up is that I'm very happy that Professor Tilley and the rest of the international legal experts have caught up to things we were saying 15 years ago. For example, if you go back to 15 years ago, people who had started from the sort of deep in the international community to talk about apartheid tried to focus their analysis only on the West Bank and Gaza. It wasn't cool to talk about refugees. It wasn't cool to talk about Palestinian citizens of Israel. I think it's a testament to our activism and organizing over the past 15, 20 years that refugees and Palestinian citizens of Israel have returned to the front and center of what we mean when we talk about the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and that's still not mainstream, right? I went to the Labor Convention a few weeks ago, the Palestine Fringe event, for example, organized by the PSC. Obviously not everybody speaking there spoke on behalf of PSC or represented the PSC's politics, but it was very, very clear that the issue of support for Palestine being support for an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, that is still a very common idea. People still very much think that support for Palestine means support for a Palestinian dictatorship in the West Bank and Gaza. that will relieve Israel of its commitments. And so we actually have internalized the Oslo framework. We've internalized UN Resolution 242 from 1967 and the subsequent, again, an example of how we've taken international legal standards or our conservative understandings of them and transformed them into the language we use to imagine the future and the language we use to make demands on our broader society and on the international community and on the perpetrators. So the reason I give all this prologue is to say I'm not going to focus on the international legal definition. There's plenty of material now. The reports that Professor Tilley highlighted for you are all plenty of information. We've been writing articles about this for 15 years. If you're interested in kind of legal training, what is the crime of apartheid, how does Israel do it, most of you have probably already done that work. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, and again, in Q&A, I'm happy to go back to the sort of legalese and talk about that stuff. The one thing I will start with, however, is that all of this talk of Israel risks becoming an apartheid state that's become popular in the past 10, 15 years since Jimmy Carter published his book, this is really bogus. Israel was an apartheid state the moment it was created. I don't say this flippantly or as a kind of rhetorical point to get you to clap. The crime of apartheid is if you commit a human rights violation in the context of trying to establish and maintain a regime of domination by one group over other groups. One of those human rights violations, very clearly stated in any definition of apartheid that you'll find, is denial of return. Israel denied the return of Palestinians, whether it expelled them at gunpoint, whether they got radio. We can accept all of the Zionist mythology about 1948, and my argument still stands. Let's say the Arab leaders came and one by one said, please leave, here's money, let's go, right? As soon as Israel said, you're not allowed to come back, and we know that this was the context of establishing a racial regime, that was the crime of apartheid. The first person not allowed back into that country, that's the moment Israel became an apartheid state. Full stop, right? We don't need more. There's, unfortunately, plenty more. And you all, especially in your activism and organism, have gone through the different examples of these human rights violations, and I don't need to convince any of you that it's being done in the context of establishing this regime of racial domination. After 1948, the picture starts to get a little bit blurry because we have a national narrative that really follows the PLO around. All of the non-PLO parts of the Palestinian people kind of get chopped off the national narrative. So they don't usually make it into everyday conversation about this. And primarily, it's the Palestinians inside historic Palestine. So from 1948 to 1966, so the eve of the 1967 war, Palestinians who managed to remain within the borders of what became Israel, yes, they were granted citizenship, but they were immediately classified as a separate part of the population. If you were Jewish Israeli in this period, you were governed under laws passed by the Knesset, the parliament, and enforced by the police, like any kind of liberal democracy. If you were a Palestinian citizen of the State of Israel, you were governed under military law, and this was enforced by the same body, the military, that passed those laws. So the military commander for your region would issue military orders, and those would be the law as it concerned you. And most of these military orders were basically designed to prevent any kind of mobility. You needed written permission from the military commander if you wanted to leave or enter your neighborhood or your village. But the main purpose of them was further land confiscation. And again, there's a lot of detail here, and I'm happy to come back to this. So if you'd like to ask, how did the military regime period affect land confiscation? I'd be happy to talk about it in the question and answer period. What I want to give you is a sense of the two main thrusts of how Palestinians experience Israeli colonialism, which very clearly also parallel South African colonialism, which we think of as apartheid. I think, by the way, the fixation on apartheid in South Africa as a term is largely due to the fact that if we were to just call it colonialism, it would implicate the United States, Australia, Canada, the British Empire. I really do. The same with ethnic cleansing, by the way. The same with ethnic cleansing. There's no crime of ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing was something the international community came up in the Yugoslavia, Milosevic, early mid-90s, so that they wouldn't say genocide. right? So the international community has a habit of neologism, of coming up with words that are not directly crimes to say that, okay, here's this exceptional case. What happened in South Africa was not exceptional, right? Settler colonialism was not exceptional, and we see this, the entire Americas, most of Southeast Asia, and Palestine. In terms of what this colonialism looks like, and you will see the parallels with South Africa if you like to, I argue that it's about land and people. I'm not original in this argument because it's quite blatantly obvious if you're just trying to look at how this story unfolds. For me, the blueprint for all of this happened in the southern half of the country. Before 1948, according to the British occupation census, over 100,000 Palestinians lived in this area, and less than 1% of the population was Jewish. So if you can see the map, or you can't, it's the southern half. It's what many of you may recognize as the Negev, in Arabic the Naqab. It's literally half the country, and it's usually the forgotten half of the country. Between 1948 and 1953, Israel expels over 90,000 Palestinians from this area. So when we say that what do we say? We say 2/3 of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are refugees. 1/3 of them are expelled from here. Also, when you talk about the Arab al-Jahalin and the Bedouin tribes around Jerusalem, they were expelled from here. That's how they ended up in the West Bank. Also, many of the Palestinians in Egypt and in Jordan are among those expelled from here. By the early 50s, what the Israelis have managed to do is actually to kind of concentrate all the Palestinians who remain, about 10 to 15,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel, into this area, just here. Palestinians call it Mantiqat al-Siyaj, the fenced area, right? So remember, military rule period, you needed permission to move. So you definitely couldn't leave this area, and you needed permission to move within the villages in this area. Beginning in 1958, Israel begins a whole kind of radically new approach to these communities. In 1965, it passes a law called the Planning and Construction Law, which is a zoning law. It's a very boring and huge law that doesn't look like there's anything discriminatory in it. The reason it's important is that it's supposed to be comprehensive. Because it lists all the communities in Israel, any community not listed ceased to exist the moment that law was passed. So all the blue dots on this map, right, are villages that were not listed. There's another few dozen of them in the Galilee as well. Overnight, these places ceased to exist, which meant that no water, no electricity, no municipal services, but also any construction. If you take two sticks, tie them to each other, and plant it in the ground, that's illegal construction. Right? So that's something that the Israeli authorities can issue a demolition order against. So all of the houses in these again, Palestinian citizens of Israel became illegal. This is a kind of zoom-in view. So there are those blue dots. What's interesting is that from 1968 to 1982, Israel recognized 7 of these communities. That's the green blotches on here. In Hebrew, these became called the Rikuzim, or the concentration townships. So it was kind of very clear to people in the area what was going on. And this is why I say this is a blueprint. Basically what the idea was, and by the way, Ariel Sharon was one of the masterminds behind this, which is important because he's one of the people who's going to import it into the West Bank in a minute, is that Palestinians who live anywhere outside of the recognized villages even if they're citizens, are essentially are violating the law. They shouldn't be there. What that means is they can't get access to basic services and utilities. You can get those, you can build a house and it won't be destroyed if you move into the recognized villages, right? And so what we get is the one maxim that helps us explain everything that Israel has done to Palestinians, which is maximum land under exclusive Jewish control, minimum Palestinians on that land, which also translates mathematically into the maximum number of Palestinians either outside the country or concentrated on the smallest pieces of land. Right? And so this is what the Rikuzim, the concentration towns, are. They're basically a way to get the largest number of Palestinians squeezed into one area so that the rest can be made available to Jewish colonization and settlement. Yes? Again, I would be happy in the Q&A to come back and give examples and show you pictures. It's quite devastating, and terrible. I think some of you have probably visited the Naqab and have seen this firsthand. What I want to do is move it into what happens after 1967, because this is quite crucial, especially for the political side of our activism. The same logic is attempted as a plan. So in 1967, when Israel occupies the West Bank and Gaza Strip, it's a much larger population. They can't do what they did after 1948, which was to give citizenship to the very small number of Palestinians who remained. Here you had almost 1 million Palestinians occupied in 1967. So this would have radically just sort of destroyed any hope of an exclusive Jewish state if these Palestinians were given citizenship, right? That demographic issue would have flared up. And it's interesting that Israel always counts the population between the river and the sea. So when they are monitoring their stats, they're not just counting their own citizens. They count everyone between the river and the sea. And when it hits these landmark points like, oh, we have 40% now are Gentiles, non-Jews between the river and the sea, you see them issue a report, and sort of the Israeli press will kind of panic together about it. So they needed a plan for how to deal with the West Bank and Gaza Strip after 1967, and the person who gave them the plan is this very important character, Yigal Allon. And what Allon says is, we'll do something where we'll take control of all the border areas, so the orange is going to go under Israeli control, and we'll split the West Bank into 2 parts by extending Jerusalem through the largest Jewish settler colony in the West Bank called Ma'ali Adumim, down to the Jordan Valley. And so Palestinians will exist in 3 kind of bubbles: Northwest Bank, Southwest Bank, and a part of the Gaza Strip. The idea here was to make this affordable. Let's keep in mind, there's an issue about geographic control, but then there's an issue about civilian control. Controlling civilians is expensive, and they were looking for something long-term. And the idea here was that the Jordanian state would come in and administer the municipal affairs of the Palestinians. This was called the Jordan option. Pay attention, because this is actually resurging right now. The Jordan option is coming back. It made another comeback in the 80s as well. What's important, though, is how this plan is changed. And it's changed particularly by Ariel Sharon, the World Zionist Organization, and Likud in the early 1980s. And the idea here is, we don't trust Jordan. We've made a commitment to the Egyptians under the Camp David agreements, which may force us to come up with some performance of Palestinian autonomy. Plus, we need to find our own long-term solution to this issue of civilian administration. And so what Sharon does is he experiments with something that's now been forgotten, and which I think really needs to kind of make a comeback, something called the village leagues, Rawabit al-Qura. What the village leagues were was an attempt to recruit Palestinians from the villages, so from the rural areas, Palestinians who would be willing to be Israel's partners, to police Palestinians on behalf of Israel, and thereby claim a leadership and representative leadership role of the Palestinian community. They wanted essentially to create their own Bantustan administration, right? This was the exact same time that South Africa was doing it. I think Professor Tilly was right on when she said that the Israelis were learning from the South Africans. I think without this example, she can't see the historical trajectory that they actually kind of started at the same time. So in the late 70s, early 80s, the South African apartheid regime tried to market the Bantustans as independent sovereign states, the way Israel is trying to market the Palestinian Authority as one now. And so it took its friends, gave them a flag, gave them kind of police forces with weapons, gave them something that looked like a government. And in return, they got access to a lot of power and money, but also Israeli backing. What happened in the South African case was the ANC and the anti-apartheid liberation movement resistance actually stopped any other country from recognizing any of the Bantustans as independent states. With one exception, the Bantustan Bophuthatswana opened up an embassy. Any guesses where?
Israel.
Tel Aviv, yeah. In the case of Palestine, however, there was an uprising in the West Bank. There was an intifada in 1981 that's been completely forgotten. And for a year, people systematically prevented anyone from setting up village leagues. the village leagues that had been established were surrounded, pelted with stones, not able to leave their own offices. They got members of their own family to denounce them. People organizers would arrange these large sort of festivals where people associated with the village leagues would come in front of the entire community and say, I don't have anything to do with it. I'm sorry I ever signed up. It's nothing we should ever do, right? And they were crushed. The village leagues were destroyed by this intifada. It was an incredible moment. But what's interesting about it is that the infrastructure and the ideas for how you would establish a Palestinian-run authority that would police Palestinians on behalf of Israel, that work was done. And so if we look at the Oslo agreements, the actual work of the Oslo agreements, the authorities of the Palestinian Authority are copied and pasted from the authorities that were created for the village leagues. The major difference is that the main slogan in the fight against the village leagues is, you, Israel, don't get to impose a leadership on us. We have a leadership. It's called the Palestine Liberation Organization, and it's the only leadership we're going to acknowledge. And so, in the early 90s, Israel comes in and says, haha, you know that sole legitimate representative of yours? Well, they're the village league now. And we're going to sign this Oslo agreement with them, and they're going to police you on our behalf. What do you say to that? And we've been stuck in a bit of a quagmire since. Especially for solidarity movement work, for example, right? We always come to this position, one of the questions even this morning showed it, is, wait, how are we taking this position when the official PLO, Palestinian State, Palestinian Authority, whatever we want to call it, that muddle of official Palestinian representation, if they're saying we're okay with a two-state solution and we should only boycott the settlements and they're doing security coordination, handing prisoners over to Israel, how are we supposed to be more royal than the Pope as solidarity activists and take a more radical position than that, right? And here's your answer, right? The Palestinian Authority does not represent the Palestinian population. They've actually actively cut their ties with the broader Palestinian population. As diaspora Palestinians, as Sarona's talk shows, we've been completely orphaned from our leadership for at least 20, 30 years, right? We've never been consulted about anything that they do. They know very clearly that they've given up on most of our fundamental rights. And the Oslo agreements have kind of epitomized it, right? So that Sharon plan I showed you from the early 80s, even geographically, was imposed the exact same way, right? This is the map from the Sharon-Robles plan of 1981. And it's kind of the map you know, right? And so what we have is, and here what I'm talking about is actually sort of an exercise of comparison with South Africa that's not about the definition of apartheid. What I'm talking about is the comparison with South Africa as an anti-colonial, anti-settler colonial liberation struggle, right? Where part of the leadership, they tried to co-opt part of the leadership by creating an indigenous leadership that would be loyal to the Zionist project. In the case of South Africa, those people weren't necessarily crushed, right? If you remember the early 90s, during the negotiations for Mandela's release, some of the greatest conflict in South Africa was the black-on-black violence that we heard about in those years, right? Was the liberation movement fighting the Buthelezis and the Bantustan administrators and their goons, right? And that's part of what we're having now. It's not being stated as such yet in Palestine, but we have protests that are being repressed by Palestinian Authority goons that are taking on very similar dynamics of, you are the first line of defense of the Zionist military state, and we are here to fight you because you are now the primary obstacle, primary in the sense of first, the first obstacle we face when we try to confront Israeli soldiers, Israeli walls, and the Israeli military. So we have these very kind of clear similarities about what's being done to the land, what's being done to the people, and the thing I'm trying to really hit home is what's being done to the political leadership, right? Our political leadership has become hostage to the colonizer, and has been. And this has affected solidarity activism. For the political leadership and for Zionism, the greatest sort of security valve that they have in the worst case scenario is Palestinian statehood. The apartheid I might finish even before that, for the first time in my life. If I can remember my train of thought. What was I saying? The apartheid, yeah.
Statehood, was it statehood?
Okay, well, thanks for paying attention. Yeah. Palestinian statehood, exactly. So, one of the biggest dangers that we face is this issue of Palestinian statehood. Palestinian statehood is our enemy. Yes? And this is something that we need to now, we've coasted by without a political analysis and just on a legal analysis for longer than it should have been possible, right? We've been pointing to human rights violations, crimes against humanity, because it's an easy argument, right? Israel makes it easy because it's such a gross violator of human rights and international, and the laws of war. But if we're going to move forward, we're going to actually have to start to develop a political analysis. And that's harder to do, it's more contentious, and you may have Palestinians arguing against you. But then it's an issue about, what does your solidarity mean politically? Is this just, are you all international lawyers in this room, or are you political organizers in a liberation struggle? And these are choices you make, right? And obviously a boycott of settlement goods is part of a broader boycott of Israeli goods, right? So they don't necessarily have to always be seen in contradiction to one another. But politically, this is Palestinian statehood. The idea of Palestinian statehood as is an idea of a Bantustan state, is another Boko Tatswana. We've been saying this since the early 90s. It's great that other more established figures have now caught on, right? So this is hopefully a positive indication that the winds are changing and there's a return to a political analysis beyond just a legal analysis, right? Now I hope you will be armed with this political analysis, that this issue of statehood is something to be very, very cautious of. Not just on the one-state solution versus two-state solution issue of that kind of sloganeering that can go back and forth between those two poles, but on the issue of what Palestinian statehood actually entails. And Palestinian statehood, what it actually entails under this structure, right? And again, as Professor Tilley said, it's not a comment on a particular individual or a particular party. But under this structure, Palestinian statehood is the Bantustan state, right? And has been theorized as such by Israeli military strategists from the mid-1970s. And that fact hasn't made it into our conversation. The fact that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza rose up in an intifada in 1981 specifically against this kind of fake Palestinian Bantustan leadership is also something that's been conveniently dropped off the map of the Palestinian national narrative. And now, hopefully, is starting to come back. And the few voices that were trying to point this out are now maybe finally being heard. So I'm happy to talk more about it, but thank you for listening.